There was a time when night did not belong to sleep, when darkness was not something people trusted, and when entire towns rested only because one man kept walking, slowly, endlessly, through streets that no one else dared to claim. Before streetlights, before police, before locked doors meant safety, there was the night watchman. A quiet figure moving through the dark, listening for sounds that should not be there, watching for fires that had not yet begun, and guarding people who would never know his name. Tonight, we will walk with him. Welcome to the Silent Archive. You can lower the brightness of your screen now, or turn it off completely if you prefer only the sound. You may want to turn on a fan, or let a soft noise fill the room, something steady and unchanging. There is no need to focus, no need to remember details, and no need to stay awake. This story will move slowly, and nothing urgent will happen. In medieval towns and early modern cities, night was not a peaceful extension of the day. It was a separate world entirely, a place where rules weakened, where fire spread easily, where theft felt simpler, and where help was far away. When the sun disappeared, most people withdrew behind wooden doors, secured with bars, bolts, or prayers, and waited for morning. But one person did not. The night watchman began his work as others ended theirs, stepping into streets that emptied quickly, his footsteps becoming the only regular sound in the town. He carried a lantern, not to chase away the dark completely, but to hold it back just enough to see the next few steps, the shape of the road, the outline of a doorway, the corner where trouble might choose to gather. His route was always the same, not because repetition was comforting, but because predictability made him visible, and visibility made him necessary. Every hour he stopped at familiar points, raised his voice, and called out the time. The words mattered less than the sound itself. The call was proof that someone was awake, that the town was not abandoned to the night, that order still existed even when most eyes were closed. People heard him through walls and shutters, half asleep, and turned over in their beds knowing, without thinking, that everything was still where it should be. The watchman did not hurry. There was nowhere to go faster, and nothing waiting at the end of his route. Speed created mistakes, and mistakes at night had consequences that daylight could not undo. He walked past bakeries cooling from the day's work, past workshops silent and locked, past churches standing darker than usual, their stone absorbing moonlight without reflection. In narrow streets, his lantern glow bent and stretched against walls, briefly illuminating marks left by cars, footprints pressed into dirt, and the signs of ordinary life paused rather than ended. Most nights were uneventful, and that was the point. The watchman existed so that nothing happened. He was paid little, respected quietly, and remembered rarely. Children were warned about the night, not comforted by the presence of the man who guarded it. Adults accepted his work as part of the town's breathing, unnoticed until it stopped. As the hours passed, the night deepened, and even the occasional sounds faded. No more doors opened. No voices answered his calls. Only the steady pattern of walking, calling, listening, and moving on remained. The night watchman learned early that darkness was not empty. It was crowded with small things that moved just beyond certainty, with sounds that never repeated themselves in quite the same way, and with long pauses in which the town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see whether the night would pass quietly or demand attention. His lantern did not push the dark away. It negotiated with it. The flame flickered inside its metal frame, responding to wind that could not be seen, to cold that pressed inward from stone walls, and to the slow fatigue of the oil that fed it. Every few streets he adjusted his grip, not because the lantern was heavy, but because holding anything for hours eventually reminded the body that it existed. In some towns, the watchman carried a staff or a halberd that had seen better years, its blade dulled more by time than use. The weapon was symbolic, meant to suggest authority rather than enforce it, and most nights it struck nothing at all, tapping lightly against cobblestones as he walked, adding a second rhythm to the sound of his steps. The streets changed character as the hours passed. Early in the night, they still remembered the day. Warmth lingered near ovens and chimneys, and the smell of bread, metal, or damp wool floated low and close to the ground. Later, those traces thinned, replaced by the cooler scent of stone and earth, and finally by almost nothing at all, a neutral emptiness that felt less like air and more like absence. He knew which doors belonged to families with infants, which windows would remain slightly open no matter the season, and which corners gathered stray animals seeking whatever scraps the day had left behind. These details were never written down. They lived only in repetition, in the quiet accumulation of nights that blurred together until memory became instinct. Every call of the hour echoed differently. In narrow streets, his voice returned to him quickly, compressed and altered, as if the town were answering back in fragments. In open squares, the sound stretched outward and thinned, losing certainty as it traveled, until it faded into something that felt less like speech and more like proof that time was still moving. Sometimes a light appeared behind a shutter, just briefly, as someone half awake checked that the voice they heard belonged where it should. The light would vanish again without ceremony, and the watchman would continue, never acknowledging it, never pausing, never breaking the order of his route. Order mattered. A missed call, a shortened circuit, or a step taken too quickly invited questions the night was eager to ask. Consistency was protection, not only for the town, but for the watchman himself. As long as he followed the pattern, the night remained something that happened around him, not to him. There were moments when nothing at all occurred for such long stretches that time seemed to flatten. Minutes lost their edges. Hours dissolved into one another. The watchman marked progress not by clocks, but by landmarks. A cracked fountain, a leaning post, a doorway carved deeper by generations of hands resting there briefly before entering or leaving. Fatigue did not arrive suddenly. It settled gradually, a quiet weight behind the eyes, a slight delay between thought and movement, a growing awareness of the body's insistence that night was meant for stillness. He responded not with resistance, but with adjustment, slowing just enough to maintain control, listening more carefully when sight grew uncertain. In the distance, church bells waited for morning, silent and patient. The watchman did not measure his success by reaching dawn. Dawn was simply what came next, inevitable and indifferent to his effort. His work existed entirely within the hours when most people forgot the world continued without them. He passed the same places again and again, yet they were never identical. Shadows shifted slightly. Clouds altered the moon's shape. A door that had been closed for weeks might stand ajar one night, inviting a pause, a longer look, a careful approach that ended, most often, in nothing more than reassurance. This was the true nature of his duty: attention without reward, movement without destination, and vigilance without conclusion. And so the night stretched on, unbroken, quietly occupied by the steady presence of one man walking, calling the hours, and holding together a town that would never thank him for it. As the years passed, the night watchman became a figure shaped as much by time as by duty. His body learning the exact distance of each street, his feet memorizing uneven stones long before his eyes found them, and his thoughts settling into a rhythm that matched the slow turning of the hours. He did not think of his work as endurance, because endurance implies an end, and his nights rarely felt like they were moving toward anything at all. In many towns, the watchman worked alone, not because company was unnecessary, but because silence was easier to manage when it belonged to only one person. Two voices disrupted the night's balance. Two lanterns created uncertainty. One man, one light, one route. This simplicity reduced mistakes, and mistakes were remembered long after quiet nights were forgotten. Age revealed itself gradually, first in the knees, then in the shoulders, then in the way cold settled deeper into the bone, even after morning arrived. The watchman adjusted again, lengthening his pauses, leaning briefly against familiar walls, standing still long enough to listen before moving forward once more. The town changed slowly around him. Shops closed and reopened under new names. Families moved, children grew tall and left, and roofs were repaired in slightly different shapes. Yet the night remained resistant to progress, holding on to habits long after daylight had abandoned them. New tools arrived, new laws were written, but the watchman still walked, still called the hours, still carried a flame that could be extinguished by a careless wind. Sometimes he encountered another soul awake, a traveler arriving too late to find an inn open, a midwife moving urgently between houses, or a drunk who mistook the night for safety. These encounters were brief and restrained, words exchanged softly, identities questioned without suspicion, and then dissolved back into separation. The watchman was not there to interfere with life, only to ensure it did not unravel. The most dangerous enemy was not crime, but fire. A single spark, left unattended, could erase an entire street before anyone woke. So the watchman watched roofs as carefully as doors, sniffing the air for changes too subtle to name, learning the difference between warmth and warning, between a hearth settling and a disaster beginning. Some nights tested him more than others. Storms erased familiar landmarks, rain flattened sound until footsteps vanished, and wind twisted his lantern flame into something unreliable and nervous. During these hours he shortened his route, stayed closer to main roads, and trusted memory more than sight. The town felt smaller then, compressed inward by weather and darkness, as if the night itself were leaning closer. There were also nights of unnatural stillness, no wind, no animals, no distant movement. These were the hardest. Silence, this complete, did not comfort. It suggested attention, as if the darkness were listening back, waiting to see whether the watchman would falter or forget a call or break the pattern that held everything in place. He never did. Not because he was brave, but because habit had replaced fear. Fear required imagination, and imagination dulled after thousands of identical circuits. The night became familiar, not friendly, but known well enough to navigate without surprise. Eventually, the idea of a night watchman began to feel old. New systems appeared, locks improved, street lighting advanced slowly, then all at once. People trusted structures more than individuals, and the idea that one man could hold a town together started to seem unnecessary, even quaint. Routes were shortened. Calls were reduced. Wages shrank. In some places, the watchman was kept more out of tradition than need, a reminder of how things used to be, rather than how they still were. And still he walked. He walked through streets now faintly lit by lamps that made his lantern redundant, through neighborhoods that slept more deeply than before, trusting mechanisms rather than memory. Fewer windows answered his calls. Fewer people stirred. The night no longer required proof that someone was awake. Yet the watchman continued, his presence gradually unnoticed, his footsteps absorbed into a world that no longer listened for them. By the time the watchman understood that he was becoming unnecessary, the realization arrived without drama, without announcement, and without any single moment that could be pointed to as the beginning of the end. It revealed itself only through absence, through things that no longer happened, and through the growing quiet that followed his voice when he called the hours into streets that no longer waited for them. The lamps changed the night first. They did not banish darkness, but they weakened it, breaking it into smaller, less confident pieces that gathered only where light could not quite reach. Corners softened, shadows thinned. The lantern he carried became an old habit rather than a necessity, its flame competing gently with a glow that asked nothing of him. People slept differently once the lamps arrived. Doors closed with more certainty. Windows stayed shut. The half-conscious listening that once followed each hourly call slowly disappeared until his voice passed unnoticed, absorbed by walls that no longer expected reassurance. The watchman noticed this before anyone else did. He noticed because nothing escaped his attention. That had always been his task. But now attention revealed not danger, not disorder, only the gradual withdrawal of meaning. There were fewer interruptions, no travelers wandering in too late, no animals testing the silence, no flickers of candlelight behind shutters. The night had become efficient, regulated, predictable in a way that left little room for a man whose purpose depended on uncertainty. Even his route began to feel ceremonial. The same streets, the same turns, but without consequence. He walked them not because the town required it, but because he always had, and stopping would have required explanation. When new watchmen were trained, they were younger, faster, and instructed differently. They learned procedures rather than patterns, rules rather than instincts. They carried whistles instead of voices, keys instead of lanterns, and they were taught to wait for trouble rather than prevent it through presence alone. He did not resent them. Resentment required comparison, and comparison required a belief that something had been taken away. The watchman did not think in those terms. He understood replacement as a function of time, the same way day replaced night without judgment or apology. Gradually, he found himself alone on routes that once required several men. In smaller towns, the watch was reduced to a single figure, walking hours that grew shorter each year until the work no longer stretched from dusk to dawn, but occupied only a narrow slice of the night, as if the darkness itself had become manageable. There were nights when he passed through entire districts without hearing his own footsteps echo. The stones had been repaired, the streets widened, sound no longer lingered. The town absorbed him completely, leaving nothing behind to suggest he had passed through at all. Records of his work were sparse, a name on a payroll, a line in a ledger, a uniform issued and reissued until the cloth thinned beyond usefulness. No one wrote about the nights he prevented from becoming stories. No one documented the fires that never started, the thefts that did not occur, or the moments when fear dissolved simply because someone was awake. Eventually, the calls stopped. Not all at once, but 1 hour at a time. First, the late hours were removed, then the early ones, until silence replaced his voice entirely. The town no longer measured its nights by sound, and the absence went unnoticed. He continued walking after that, quietly, without announcement, passing through streets that no longer expected acknowledgement. The lantern was left behind one night, forgotten without regret. The darkness did not respond. In the end, there was no final patrol, no last route marked or remembered. He simply stopped appearing, and the night adjusted without pause, folding his absence into itself the same way it had once folded around his presence. The role did not die. It thinned, faded, and dissolved into other systems, other names, other forms of watching that required no footsteps and left no memory behind. And the streets remained, quiet, orderly, unaware of how much of their past had been carried night after night by one man walking slowly, calling the hours, until there was no one left who needed to hear them. Long after the watchman himself had vanished from the routes he once knew by instinct, the night continued to carry traces of the work he had done, though no one living could have named them, and no record existed to explain why certain habits remained even after their purpose had been forgotten. Some streets still emptied earlier than others, not because danger lingered there, but because generations had learned, quietly and without instruction, that night belonged to caution. Doors were still checked twice in houses whose locks had never failed. Windows were closed against no particular threat. These behaviors survived not as knowledge, but as instinct, passed forward without explanation. The disappearance of the watchman did not arrive as a loss. Loss requires awareness, and the town had already learned to sleep without listening. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement, and no adjustment period marked by uncertainty. The night had become smooth, efficient, and almost entirely unobserved. Artificial light spread further each year. Lamps multiplied. Then electricity replaced flame, and the dark retreated to narrow spaces where it no longer commanded respect. The idea that darkness needed watching began to feel outdated, even faintly absurd, as though fear itself had been a superstition rather than a response to reality. Yet something else took the watchman's place. Not a person, but a system. Rules replaced routines. Schedules replaced memory. And responsibility, once carried by a single walking figure, was distributed so thinly across institutions that it no longer resembled vigilance at all. The night, once monitored, became simply unused. People moved through it rarely and quickly, treating it as an interruption rather than a condition. Streets existed primarily for daylight. Buildings turned inward. The town no longer faced the dark, it ignored it. In older districts where the lamps flickered or failed, the night returned in pieces, not as danger, but as unfamiliarity. These were the places where people felt uneasy without knowing why, where footsteps sounded louder than expected, and where silence felt less neutral. No one remembered that these were once the watchman's routes. Archives preserved little. A mention in a municipal expense book. A regulation outlining duties that no longer existed. A job title listed among others that had faded away. Their functions absorbed into modern language until the original meaning dissolved. The watchman's knowledge, the precise understanding of sound, the awareness of how a town breathed at night, the ability to distinguish between ordinary stillness and warning, was never transferred. It disappeared with the last men who carried it, unrecorded because it seemed too obvious to preserve. Occasionally, someone walking late would notice the absence of sound and feel watched despite knowing no one was there. This sensation passed quickly, dismissed as imagination or fatigue. Few considered that the feeling might be inherited, a memory left behind by centuries of being observed. The night did not become safer when the watchman vanished. It became quieter. Safety, like danger, proved difficult to measure without a witness. Cities grew larger. Streets widened. Movement replaced stillness. The idea of one person holding order through presence alone became unthinkable, not because it was impossible, but because it no longer fit the scale of things. And yet in smaller towns and in older neighborhoods where progress arrived unevenly, something similar persisted. A guard making rounds, a caretaker checking doors. A figure whose job description sounded modern, but whose purpose was ancient. These people did not call the hours. They did not carry lanterns. They did not walk for the sake of being seen. But they existed for the same reason, to confirm, silently, that the night had not been abandoned. The watchman's legacy was not continuity, but imprint. The idea that darkness required attention did not disappear. It simply changed shape. And so the night remained, less feared, less observed, and largely unremarked upon, stretching between days that refused to acknowledge how much of their order had once depended on a single presence, moving slowly through empty streets, ensuring that nothing happened, and leaving behind no proof that he had ever been there. Even as memory thinned, and language lost the words to describe what the watchman once was, the night itself did not forget so easily, because nights are shaped less by records than by repetition. And repetition leaves marks that survive long after meaning fades. In places where towns expanded unevenly, where new streets pressed against old ones without fully replacing them, the difference could still be felt after sunset. Light behaved differently there. Sound lingered longer than expected. Steps echoed once too many times. These were not dangerous places, only unfinished ones, areas where the modern night had not entirely settled, and where the absence of a human presence felt more noticeable than its return ever had. People describe these streets as uncomfortable or strangely empty without knowing why emptiness itself could feel occupied. They hurried through without looking up, phones glowing in their hands, their attention narrowed to the next pool of light, never suspecting that centuries earlier, this same ground had been paced deliberately, measured by footsteps rather than distance. The watchman's work had never been about confrontation. He was not there to chase, to accuse, or to correct. His power had come from visibility, from the simple fact of being present in a space where presence was rare. This kind of authority left no monument behind. It could not be rebuilt once removed, only replaced with something louder and less personal. As cities modernized, attention fragmented. Responsibility was divided among devices, signals, and distant watchers who observed from rooms far removed from the streets themselves. The night became something monitored rather than known, tracked by indicators instead of instincts. Where the watchman had once listened, systems now measured. Where he had noticed changes in silence, machines waited for thresholds to be crossed. Something subtle was lost in that exchange, though it was difficult to explain without sounding nostalgic. The watchman had not been efficient. He had been thorough. He did not react quickly. He reacted early. His presence discouraged rather than responded, a quality that left no data behind to justify itself. In older accounts, rare and often overlooked, there are brief references to men who knew the night too well. They could tell which houses were restless by the way shutters moved, which streets were uneasy by the way sound failed to travel, which hours carried more tension than others without any visible cause. These observations were never formal knowledge. They lived only as long as someone remained awake to hold them. When the last watchman aged out of their routes, there was no transfer of this awareness. No one asked them to explain what they listened for or how they sensed a problem before it existed. The questions arrived too late, after the need for such knowing had already been dismissed. The night adjusted, as it always does. It accepted cameras, lights, and patrols that moved faster than memory. But it also retained its older shape beneath these layers, waiting quietly in the spaces between illumination, where no one stood still long enough to notice. Occasionally, during power failures or heavy storms, the modern systems faltered. Lights went dark, signals dropped, streets emptied again, not by habit, but by instruction. In these moments, the night briefly resembled its former self, unclaimed, unwatched, and uncertain. People spoke of these hours as unsettling, as if something essential were missing, without realizing that the discomfort came not from danger, but from the sudden absence of reassurance. There was no voice calling the hour, no figure moving steadily through the dark. The street, still standing, continued to wait through the hours of darkness, remembering without words what it had meant to be watched. The longer the watchman remained absent, the more complete his erasure appeared. And yet the night itself continued to behave as though it remembered being addressed, as though it had once been spoken to regularly, and now waited out of habit for a voice that would never return. In towns that preserved their older layouts, where streets curved instead of intersected cleanly, and where buildings leaned toward one another as if sharing weight, night still arrived with a sense of compression. Sound traveled unpredictably. Distance felt distorted. People underestimated how far they could see and overestimated how alone they were. These were not design flaws. They were remnants of a world built with the assumption that someone would be moving through it after dark. The watchman had once provided continuity. His presence stitched 1 hour to the next, making the night feel navigable rather than endless. Without him, the dark fractured into segments, an unbroken block of time, rather than a sequence of moments acknowledged and passed. Modern life adapted quickly. Clocks replaced calls, alerts replaced listening. Safety became statistical, measured in trends and probabilities, rather than in the quiet confidence that came from knowing someone was nearby, awake, and paying attention. Yet attention itself became rare. People moved through darkness accompanied by distraction, eyes fixed on illuminated screens, ears filled with sound not shaped by the space around them. The night no longer required interpretation. It was treated as neutral, an absence of activity rather than a condition with character. This shift altered behavior in subtle ways. People stopped noticing when streets felt different at certain hours. They ignored changes in sound, in air, in movement. Where the watchman once adjusted his pace instinctively, modern walkers trusted that systems would respond if something went wrong, without considering what might be missed in the moments before response became necessary. The watchman's familiarity, the deep, unremarkable knowledge of how normal felt, so that deviation revealed itself naturally. This kind of knowing required time, patience, and repetition, qualities that could not be automated and were therefore abandoned. In some places, municipal records briefly attempted to preserve the role. Committees debated duties that no longer aligned with reality. Descriptions grew vague. Responsibilities overlapped with newer positions. Eventually, the title disappeared entirely, absorbed into language that favored abstraction over presence. What replaced the watchman was never singular. It was a network of partial solutions: lighting to remove shadows, surveillance to observe from afar, law enforcement to intervene after disruption. Each addressed a fragment of what the watchman had once embodied, but none replaced the whole. The night responded by becoming less personal. It no longer recognized individuals. It accepted passage, but did not acknowledge it. People walked through it rather than with it. Their awareness narrowed to destination rather than environment. And still, on certain nights, the old tension returned without explanation. A street felt longer than it should. A silence arrived too abruptly. A space between lights seemed heavier than expected. These sensations did not lead to action. They dissolved as quickly as they appeared, dismissed by reason or routine. But they were echoes. They belonged to a time when the night was shared responsibility, when darkness was managed rather than ignored, and when one person's steady movement created a boundary between order and uncertainty. The watchman's labor had never been heroic. It had been accumulative. Night after night, his steps layered reassurance onto reassurance until safety felt natural rather than earned. Once removed, that accumulation faded slowly, leaving behind an emptiness that did not alarm, only unsettled. Even now, in cities that never truly sleep, there are hours when activity thins just enough for the night to assert itself. Between shifts, between departures, between obligations. In these gaps, the darkness briefly regains depth, and the absence of a human witness becomes noticeable. No one names this feeling. There is no language for it anymore, but it lingers, quietly reminding those who pass through that the night was once not merely endured or avoided, but actively held together by a presence so ordinary that its disappearance went almost entirely unrecorded. And so the night continues, layered with light, structured by systems, and largely unattended, carrying within it the faint, persistent memory of footsteps that once gave it shape, pace, and meaning. As time continued to stretch forward, the distance between the present night and the night the watchman once knew grew so wide that comparison itself became difficult. Yet the structure of darkness remained stubbornly similar, as though the hours after sunset resisted being entirely redesigned. In the oldest quarters of cities where renovation arrived reluctantly and unevenly, the night still behaved according to older rules. Light pooled rather than spread. Sound gathered in corners and refused to move on. Footsteps carried a weight they did not have elsewhere. These areas were not avoided for rational reasons, only described as places that felt different, places where movement instinctively slowed and attention sharpened without conscious effort. The watchman would have recognized these signals immediately. They were the language of the night, spoken not in words but in pressure, in spacing, in the way air seemed to thicken after certain hours. He had learned this language not through training, but through exposure, through the quiet accumulation of nights spent listening when there was nothing obvious to hear. Modern observers rarely linger long enough to experience this shift fully. Efficiency discourages pause. Movement is constant. The night is treated as an obstacle to be crossed, rather than an environment to be read. Where the watchman once stood still to understand a street, people now pass through quickly, their awareness divided among destinations, schedules, and devices. This difference altered the relationship between people and place. The watchman had belonged to the streets he walked. They shaped his movements as much as he shaped their order. In contrast, modern passage leaves little trace. Footsteps no longer establish familiarity. Presence is temporary and interchangeable. The watchman's authority had not been granted formally. It emerged from repetition, from being seen night after night, from occupying the same space long enough to become part of its expected condition. When something disrupted that expectation, it was noticed immediately, not because of threat, but because of deviation. Deviation now requires thresholds. Alarms must be triggered. Rules must be broken visibly. Until then, everything is assumed to be normal. This assumption creates long stretches of unnoticed change, periods where subtle shifts go unaddressed because they do not yet qualify as events. The watchman's gift had been sensitivity. Not suspicion, not fear, but an awareness fine enough to detect imbalance before it announced itself. This awareness had no place in modern systems, where efficiency favored reaction over familiarity. As generations passed, the memory of being watched gently, not controlled, not surveilled, but accompanied, faded completely. People grew accustomed to solitude within crowds, to darkness filled with light but empty of presence. The idea that safety once depended on someone's endurance rather than infrastructure seemed implausible when mentioned at all. Yet endurance had been the foundation. The watchman had outlasted boredom, cold, fatigue, and doubt. He had remained awake not because he was exceptional, but because staying awake was his responsibility. In doing so, he had carried the collective vulnerability of an entire town through the most uncertain hours of the day. This vulnerability still exists, though it is rarely acknowledged. Night remains a time when vision narrows, judgment softens, and awareness drifts. No amount of lighting has altered this entirely. No system has eliminated the human need for reassurance. Occasionally, this need surfaces unexpectedly. A power outage that lasts too long, a quiet street after an event has ended. A moment when sound disappears too completely. In these instances, people feel exposed without understanding why. They look around instinctively, seeking confirmation that someone else is present, that the night is being observed. There is rarely anyone to find. The watchman's absence becomes perceptible only in contrast, in moments when modern solutions pause and the night briefly resembles what it once was, wide, unstructured, and indifferent to intention. These moments do not last, they resolve quickly, but they leave behind a faint unease, a question that dissolves before it can be articulated. The watchman would have understood this feeling. He lived inside it nightly, not as anxiety, but as awareness. He accepted the night's uncertainty and responded not with control, but with consistency. His movement reassured not by force, but by reliability. This approach left no legacy that could be quantified. No statistics recorded nights without incident. No evidence proved the value of what did not occur. As a result, the watchman vanished, not because he failed, but because his success could not be measured. And so the night grew quieter in one sense and emptier in another, filled with light but lacking acknowledgement, experienced individually rather than collectively. It became something to pass through alone, rather than something held together by shared vigilance. Still, beneath all of this, the night continues to wait, stretching patiently between sunsets and dawns, unchanged in its fundamental nature, as though expecting, not urgently, not consciously, that one evening, someone might return to walk it slowly, to learn its rhythms again, and to restore, without ceremony or recognition, the simple assurance that comes from knowing that someone is awake. The passing of time did not erase the conditions that had once made the watchman necessary. It only disguised them beneath layers of convenience and assumption, so that the night appeared tamed while remaining fundamentally unchanged. Darkness still reduced certainty. Distance still distorted judgment. Fatigue still softened attention. These were constants, unaltered by technology, only managed in different ways. The watchman had existed at the intersection of these limits, standing where human weakness met collective need. He had not solved the night. He had negotiated with it, acknowledging its presence rather than denying it, accepting that vigilance was not a state that could be switched on at will, but something that had to be sustained, step by step, hour by hour. Modern structures avoid this burden by distributing it thinly. Responsibility is shared so broadly that it becomes difficult to locate. No single person is awake for the night as a whole. Awareness is fragmented into shifts, feeds, and alerts, each attending to a portion of what once required continuity. This fragmentation creates coverage, but not familiarity. Familiarity had been the watchman's quiet advantage. He knew which sounds belonged and which did not. He sensed when a street felt wrong without being able to explain why. These judgments were not logical conclusions. They were embodied knowledge, formed through exposure rather than instruction. As this kind of knowing disappeared, so did patience for ambiguity. Modern systems demand clarity. An event must be defined before it can be addressed. Until then, uncertainty is tolerated rather than examined. The watchman had lived entirely within uncertainty, using it as a guide rather than an obstacle. This difference reshaped how nights were experienced. The watchman's night had been textured. Some hours felt heavier than others. Certain streets demanded more attention. There were moments of tension that passed without incident, and moments of calm that felt unexpectedly fragile. Each night carried its own character, its own subtle variations. The modern night is flatter, illuminated, regulated, and documented. It presents itself as uniform, encouraging the belief that 1 hour differs little from the next. Variation still exists, but it is less often noticed, because noticing requires time spent without distraction. Distraction has become the dominant companion of darkness. Where the watchman once walked with nothing but awareness, modern passersby carry layers of mediated presence. Sound, light, and information intrude constantly, reducing the space available for observation. The night becomes background rather than environment. This shift alters memory. People no longer remember nights distinctly. They remember events that occurred at night, but not the nights themselves. The watchman remembered nights even when nothing happened. Those nights accumulated, forming a continuous understanding of place that extended beyond daylight. When this continuity vanished, so did the sense that the night belonged to the town. It became an interval between days, a pause rather than a domain. The idea that night could be inhabited deliberately felt foreign once the practice disappeared. And yet, in moments of interruption, the old structure briefly reasserts itself. A citywide blackout, a snowfall that muffles sound, a curfew that empties streets unexpectedly. During these times, the night becomes noticeable again. People speak more softly. Movement slows. Attention shifts outward. These moments reveal how little has changed beneath the surface. Without constant illumination and activity, the night still exerts pressure. It still invites caution. It still feels unfinished without acknowledgement. The watchman's presence had once provided that acknowledgement. He had not made the night safe in an absolute sense. He had made it shared. His walking turned isolation into sequence, connecting one sleeping household to the next through movement that required no interaction. This shared aspect has no modern equivalent. Digital monitoring observes without participating. Automated lighting illuminates without awareness. Patrols pass through quickly, their presence intermittent rather than continuous. None of these recreate the sense that someone remains within the night for its entire duration. The watchman had belonged to the hours themselves. He entered them deliberately and left only when they were complete. In doing so, he gave shape to time that would otherwise feel amorphous and threatening. Without him, the night stretches more abstractly. People experience it in fragments, the late hour before sleep, the early hour before waking, rarely encountering it as a whole. This partial experience reinforces the belief that the night no longer requires stewardship. But stewardship was never about control. It was about presence, about acknowledging vulnerability without attempting to eliminate it, about accepting that some conditions cannot be optimized, only endured attentively. The watchman embodied this acceptance. His endurance was not a performance. It was a condition of his role. Night after night, he absorbed the uncertainty of darkness so that others would not have to consider it. As long as someone walked, called, and listened, the night remained connected to human rhythm. Once that connection dissolved, the night receded from awareness, not because it disappeared, but because no one remained long enough within it to remember what it once demanded. And so the darkness persists, patient and unchanged, stretching between days that continue to rely on it without fully understanding what was lost when the last footsteps stopped marking its hours. And so the watchman's story does not end with a final step or a last call carried into the air, because his work was never defined by moments that could be pointed to and preserved. It ended the way many essential things do, quietly, gradually, and without leaving behind a clear place to stand and say, here, this is where it stopped. The night did not mark his absence. It adapted. It always has. What disappeared was not the figure himself, but the idea that darkness required companionship, that uncertainty needed to be met with presence rather than avoidance, and that safety once depended less on control and more on someone choosing to remain awake when everyone else could rest. The Watchman was never meant to be remembered. His success relied on anonymity, on the fact that nothing happened loudly enough to demand explanation. He existed in the narrow space between order and chaos, holding it steady through repetition, so complete that it eventually became invisible. Even now, long after his routes have been paved over, his calls replaced by clocks, and his lantern rendered obsolete by endless light, the structure he upheld continues to influence how nights are lived. The expectation that morning will arrive unchanged, the assumption that streets will remain where they are, the belief that someone, somewhere, is paying attention. These assumptions did not arise on their own. They were built slowly, night after night, by people whose labor left no trace strong enough to survive modernization, but whose absence would have been felt immediately had they ever truly failed. The Watchman belongs to a category of history that resists excitement. There are no battles here, no revolutions, no decisive events, only endurance, only presence, only the quiet maintenance of normality through hours when normality felt fragile. This is the kind of history that rarely finds its way into textbooks because it offers no turning points, only continuity. And yet, without it, the stories that do survive would have unfolded very differently. Tonight, the streets are lit, the systems are active, and the night appears contained. But beneath all of this, the darkness remains what it has always been, a condition that tests attention, patience, and human limits. Once those limits were met by a single figure walking slowly through empty streets, calling the hours not to announce authority, but to confirm presence. That figure no longer walks. What remains is the space he occupied, the habits he shaped, and the faint unspoken memory of a time when the night was not something to escape or ignore, but something carefully held together until morning arrived. This has been the Silent Archive, a place for the histories that whisper rather than shout, for the lives that mattered precisely because they left so little behind, and for the long, quiet stories that unfold best when nothing urgent is expected of you. The night continues, and the archive remains open.